The world is filled with serial killers whose names you've never heard, monsters who operated in the shadows while more famous killers dominated headlines. These predators were just as brutal, just as calculating, and in some cases, even more terrifying than the household names we all know. Today, we're diving deep into the twisted minds of 5 serial killers who slipped through the cracks of public consciousness, men whose crimes were so disturbing that even seasoned investigators struggled to process what they'd uncovered. These aren't your typical serial killer stories. These are the cases that kept detectives awake at night, the crimes that made hardened cops question what they thought they knew about human nature. From a middle school aide who turned his family home into a house of horrors, to a Syrian war criminal who orchestrated mass murder on an unimaginable scale, to a trash company supervisor who hunted women in Kansas City for over a decade. Each of these killers had their own signature, their own hunting ground, their own twisted logic that drove them to destroy lives. What makes these cases now even more chilling is how these men blended into society. They had jobs, families, neighbors who thought they knew them. They attended barbecues, coached little league, worked in schools. They were the quiet guy next door, the helpful coworker, the polite stranger who offered assistance. But beneath those ordinary facades lurked something far darker, something that would eventually surface in the most horrific ways imaginable. Let's start with Kendall Francois, known as the Poughkeepsie Strangler. Picture this. It's 1998 in Poughkeepsie, New York, and women are disappearing. Not wealthy women, not college students who'd make headlines. These were sex workers, drug addicts, women society had already forgotten. The police barely noticed at first, but the families did. They knew something was wrong when their daughters, sisters, mothers simply vanished without a trace. The man responsible was hiding in plain sight. Kendall Francois stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds. His massive frame was impossible to ignore, but what people remembered most wasn't his size, it was his smell. Even as a teenager at Arlington High School, classmates called him Stinky because of the distinctive odor that seemed to follow him everywhere. That stench, it turns out, wasn't just poor hygiene. It was death itself, clinging to his clothes, seeping from his pores, announcing his presence to anyone with a functioning nose. Francois was born to Haitian parents in 1971, the second of 4 children in what appeared to be a normal household. He played football and wrestled in high school, sports that took advantage of his imposing physical presence. After graduation, he enlisted in the Army, completing basic training at Fort Sill. But the military couldn't contain whatever darkness was growing inside him. Within 4 years, he was discharged due to obesity issues, his weight having ballooned even further during his service. When he returned to New York, Francois enrolled at Dutchess Community College as a liberal arts major. He seemed to be trying to build a normal life, maybe even believed he could outrun whatever urges were consuming him. In 1994, while still attending college, he took a job that would later see him like the most terrifying irony imaginable. He became a school aide at Arlington Middle School, the same district where he'd been known as Stinky just a few years earlier. During the day, Francois worked as a part-time custodian and later as a student monitor. He was around children constantly, helping with their education, maintaining their learning environment, presenting himself as a responsible member of the community. Parents dropped their kids off at school every morning, trusting that the adults inside would keep them safe. None of them knew that one of those adults was already planning his first murder. The duality of Francois's existence during this period is what makes his case so disturbing. By day, he was cleaning classrooms and monitoring students. By night, he was cruising the streets of Poughkeepsie, looking for victims. His first target was 30-year-old Wendy Myers, a sex worker he'd hired multiple times before. On October 24, 1996, Francois picked her up at the Valley Rest Motel, a rundown establishment that catered to the city's most desperate residents. What happened next established the pattern that would define his killing spree. During what Myers thought would be another routine transaction, Francois suddenly wrapped his massive hands around her throat. His strength was overwhelming, his grip inescapable. As consciousness faded from her eyes, he felt something he'd never experienced before, a rush of power that was intoxicating, addictive. But strangulation wasn't enough. Even as Myers lay unconscious, barely clinging to life, Francois dragged her to a bathtub and held her head underwater until her body went completely still. The methodical nature of that first murder revealed something crucial about Francois's psychology. This wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of lost control. He had thought about this, planned it, fantasized about it. The combination of strangulation and drowning wasn't accidental. It was his signature, his way of asserting complete dominance over another human being. A month later, he killed again. 29-year-old Gina Barone became his second victim, murdered in his car with the same brutal efficiency. Days after that, he claimed Catherine "Kathy" Marsh, a woman who was pregnant at the time of her death. The fact that Francois killed a pregnant woman, destroying 2 lives in a single act, demonstrates the complete absence of empathy that defined his crimes. To him, his victims weren't people with hopes, dreams, families who loved them. They were objects to be used and discarded. But here's where Francois's story becomes truly nightmarish. After killing his first 3 victims, he didn't dispose of their bodies in some remote location like most serial killers. Instead, he brought them home to 99 Fulton Avenue, where he lived with his parents and younger sister. He carried these decomposing corpses into the family house and arranged them side by side in the attic like some grotesque collection. The psychological implications of this decision are staggering. Francois was living a double life so complete, so compartmentalized, that he could sit down to dinner with his family while 3 rotting corpses lay directly above their heads. He could watch television in the living room, help with household chores, maintain normal family relationships, all while the stench of death permeated the house. His family later claimed they noticed the smell, but attributed it to poor housekeeping and Francois's personal hygiene issues. They had no idea they were sharing their home with a serial killer's trophy room. This ability to maintain normalcy while surrounded by evidence of his crimes speaks to a level of psychopathy that defies comprehension. As the months passed and more women disappeared, Francois's confidence grew. He began placing bodies, not just in the attic, but in the crawl space connected to the basement where his father spent much of his free time. The proximity of the corpses to his family's daily activities seemed to excite him, as if he was playing some twisted game where the stakes were discovery and imprisonment. The most disturbing discovery would come later when police finally searched the house. In the attic, alongside the decomposing bodies, they found a children's plastic pool. Inside that pool, arranged with careful precision, were the skulls of his victims. The image of those skulls, sitting in a bright-colored kiddie pool like some hellish decoration, became one of the most haunting pieces of evidence in serial killer history. By this point, Francois had transformed his family home into something that belonged in a horror movie. The house at 99 Fulton Avenue had become a monument to death, a place where the line between the living and the dead had been completely erased. Francois's downfall came through his own carelessness and escalating boldness. The smell that had earned him the nickname Stinky in high school wasn't just poor hygiene. It was the stench of death itself seeping from his family home. Neighbors complained about the odor, but nobody suspected the horrifying truth. His parents and sister continued living in the house, somehow managing to coexist with the decay that surrounded them. The psychological compartmentalization required to maintain this facade reveals the depths of Francois's psychopathy. On September 1st, 1998, everything unraveled when Francois picked up Christine Sala, a local drug addict. He brought her to his home, pulled into the garage, and demanded sex. When she refused, he punched her in the face, grabbed her by the throat, and dragged her from the car by her hair. "I'll kill you, I'll kill you," he repeated, forcing her to perform oral sex. But Christine Sala survived. She convinced Francois to drive her back to Main Street, and she immediately reported the attack to police. When officers arrived at 99 Fulton Avenue to question Francois about the assault, they had no idea they were walking into one of the most gruesome crime scenes in American history. The house reeked of death, but Francois agreed to accompany them to the station for questioning. Over the next few hours, faced with mounting evidence, he began confessing to murder after murder. The admissions came surprisingly easily, as if he felt relief at finally being caught. The search of the Francois home required hazmat suits and breathing apparatus. What investigators found defied comprehension. Bodies in various stages of decomposition were stuffed into the attic and crawl space. Skulls were arranged in a children's plastic pool like some macabre trophy collection. The house itself was filled with garbage, rotting food, and filth, the perfect camouflage for the smell of death. How his family lived in these conditions remains one of the most disturbing aspects of the case. Francois was initially charged with 1 count of murder, but eventually confessed to killing 8 women. During his confession, he showed no remorse whatsoever. When victim impact statements were read in court, he reportedly giggled during some of the testimonies. His callousness was absolute. In February 1990, doctors discovered that Francois had contracted HIV from one of his victims. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole and sent to Attica Correctional Facility. The man who had terrorized Poughkeepsie's most vulnerable women would spend the rest of his life behind bars, eventually dying of AIDS-related complications on September 11, 2014, at Wende Correctional Facility. The Francois case exposed systemic failures in how law enforcement handled reports from sex workers. Multiple women had come forward with complaints about him, showing bruises consistent with strangulation attempts, but their testimony was dismissed or ignored. Had police taken these reports seriously, several lives could have been saved. The case became a stark reminder of how society's most vulnerable populations often suffer in silence, their cries for help falling on deaf ears until it's too late. But Kendall Francois represents something even more chilling than a typical serial killer. He wasn't a drifter or an obvious outsider. He was a school employee, a man trusted with children's safety during the day while committing horrific murders at night. He lived with his family, maintained relationships, and presented a facade of normalcy that allowed him to operate undetected for years. The duality of his existence, loving son and brother by day, remorseless killer by night, reveals how evil can hide in plain sight, wearing the mask of respectability while harboring the darkest impulses imaginable. Our next case takes us from the streets of New York to the corridors of power in the Middle East, where we encounter a different kind of monster entirely. While Kendall Francois used his hands to strangle individual victims, our next subject wielded the machinery of state terror to orchestrate mass murder on an unprecedented scale. Rifat al-Assad, known as the Butcher of Hama, stands as one of the most prolific mass murderers of the 20th century. Unlike the serial killers who stalk individuals in shadows, Assad operated in broad daylight with the full backing of military force. His crimes weren't committed in basements or abandoned buildings, but in the streets of an entire city, witnessed by thousands and documented by history. Born in 1937 in rural Syria, Rifat was the younger brother of Hafez al-Assad, who would later become Syria's president. The Assad family rose from humble beginnings to absolute power through a combination of political cunning and ruthless violence. Rifat joined the Syrian military in 1958 and quickly distinguished himself not through heroism or tactical brilliance, but through his willingness to use extreme violence against his own people. In 1971, Rifat was given command of a special paramilitary unit called the Defense Companies. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were an elite force trained specifically for internal security operations. The Soviet Union provided training and equipment, transforming the defense companies into a formidable instrument of state terror. Rifat molded this force in his own image, disciplined, ruthless, and completely loyal to the Assad regime. The defense companies became Rifat's personal army, answering only to him and operating outside normal military chains of command. They were used to crush political dissent, intimidate opposition figures, and maintain the Assad family's grip on power. But their most horrific operation was yet to come. In the early 1980s, Syria faced growing opposition from Islamist groups, particularly the Muslim Brotherhood. Rather than seek political solutions or reforms, the Assad regime chose the path of total war against its own citizens. In February 1982, when an estimated 200 to 500 militants took control of the city of Hama, President Hafez al-Assad made a decision that would stain his family's legacy forever. He ordered his brother Rifat to retake the city by any means necessary. What followed was not a military operation, but a systematic campaign of extermination. For 27 days, Rifat's defense companies besieged Hama with artillery, tanks, and aircraft. They didn't distinguish between militants and civilians, combatants and innocents. The goal wasn't just to retake the city, it was to send a message so brutal and final that no one would ever dare challenge Assad rule again. The scale of destruction was biblical. 2/3 of Hama's neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. Soldiers went door to door, executing anyone suspected of opposing the regime. Families were dragged from their homes and shot in the streets. Women were raped before being murdered. Children were killed alongside their parents. The elderly, the disabled, the sick, no one was spared. Rifat personally oversaw much of the carnage, moving through the city as his forces carried out their grisly work. He issued orders for mass executions, supervised torture sessions, and watched as entire neighborhoods burned. Survivors described him as calm and methodical, treating the slaughter like a routine administrative task. The death toll from the Hama massacre remains disputed, but conservative estimates place it between 10,000 and 40,000 people. Most were civilians who had nothing to do with the insurgency. Their only crime was living in a city that dared to resist Assad rule. Bodies were buried in mass graves or left to rot in the streets. Now we shift from the blood-soaked attic of Kendall Francois and the decimated streets of Hama to the grimy underbelly of Kansas City, where another predator stalked the shadows for over a decade. Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard didn't hide bodies in his family home or command military units. Instead, he lived a double life so convincing that even after his arrest, friends and co-workers couldn't believe the quiet, hard-working supervisor they knew was capable of such horrific crimes. Lorenzo Gilliard was born on May 24, 1950, into a family already touched by darkness. The seeds of his future crimes were planted early when his father was convicted of rape in 1970. 2 years later, Lorenzo himself would face his first rape charges, accused of choking a woman into unconsciousness during an assault. The victim identified him from a lineup, but her testimony was deemed questionable and the charges were dropped. This early brush with the law would establish a disturbing pattern. Between 1969 and 1974, Gilliard was suspected in 5 separate rape cases, yet he was never convicted. The system's failure to hold him accountable may have emboldened him to escalate his crimes from sexual assault to murder. By 1991, Gilliard had married for the 4th time and was promoted to company supervisor at a garbage disposal company, giving him control over several teams across Kansas City. To everyone around him, he seemed to have turned his life around. He was described as a model employee, quiet but reliable, someone who worked hard and minded his own business. His neighbors spoke positively of him. His co-workers respected him. This facade of normalcy would prove to be his greatest weapon, allowing him to hunt for over 15 years without arousing suspicion. But beneath this carefully constructed exterior, Gilliard was selecting his victims with chilling precision. All of his targets shared devastating similarities. They were women who worked as prostitutes, society's most vulnerable and overlooked population. He knew these women wouldn't be immediately missed, and if they were reported missing, the investigations wouldn't be prioritized. After killing them, he would remove their shoes, a disturbing signature that would later help investigators connect the murders. He would strangle them, often stuffing cloth or paper towels into their mouths, then dump their bodies in secluded areas around Kansas City. The killing spree began in 1977 with 17-year-old Stacy Swafford. She was last seen alive on April 10th, and her body was found a week later in a vacant lot bearing signs of suffocation. Investigators determined that Swafford was a transient sex worker who had recently arrived in Kansas City. 3 years later, 15-year-old Gwendolyn Keyzine was found strangled, her neck and wrists tightly wrapped with wire. The fact that she was just a teenager, barely old enough to understand the dangers of the streets, adds another layer of horror to Gilliard's crimes. He was willing to murder children. As the years passed, the bodies continued to accumulate. Margaret Miller, 17 years old, found strangled in 1982. Catherine Berry, 34, discovered in an abandoned building with a stocking wrapped around her neck. Angela Mayhew, 19, found fully clothed by the roadside, unusual because she showed no signs of sexual assault despite being a known prostitute. This deviation from his typical pattern suggests Gilliard's methods were evolving, becoming more controlled and calculated. One of the most revealing cases was that of Sheila Ingold, whose body was found inside an abandoned van that Gilliard had pretended to be interested in buying. Not only had he strangled her, but he had also stolen 2 rings from her corpse. This theft of jewelry indicates he may have been taking trophies, physical mementos to help him relive his crimes. Serial killers often keep such items as a way to maintain psychological control over their victims even after death. The final known victim was Connie Luther, found strangled in a snowdrift on January 11, 1993, with a noose made of shoelaces tied around her neck. After this murder, Gilliard's killing spree appeared to stop completely. For reasons that remain unclear, he seemed to cease his criminal activity and focus entirely on his legitimate life. This sudden cessation of violence, combined with his professional success and positive community reputation, made him an unlikely suspect when investigators finally began connecting the dots years later. The breakthrough came through advances in DNA technology and a federal initiative to re-examine cold cases. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received a multi-million-dollar federal grant specifically aimed at using new DNA technology to solve old murders. Investigators began systematically reviewing evidence from unsolved cases, looking for genetic material that could be tested with modern techniques. The process was painstaking. Evidence had to be carefully cataloged and preserved. Samples had to be located and tested. But in April 2004, the crime lab made a stunning discovery. DNA evidence from 12 different crime scenes all matched the same unknown suspect. The killer they'd been hunting for decades had left his genetic fingerprint at every single murder scene. The next step was identifying whose DNA it was. Investigators began comparing the unknown profile against their database of known offenders and people who had voluntarily provided samples during previous investigations. That's when they got their match. Lorenzo Gilliard had voluntarily provided a blood sample back in 1987 during the investigation into Sheila Ingold's murder. At the time, he was considered just one of many potential suspects, and the technology didn't exist to definitively connect him to the crime. But now, 17 years later, that same blood sample would be his downfall. The irony is devastating. Gilliard's own cooperation with police, his willingness to provide DNA to help catch a killer, ultimately proved he was the killer they were looking for. When investigators realized they had their man, they moved quickly. On April 16, 2004, Lorenzo Gilliard was arrested at his workplace, surrounded by the same co-workers who had known him for years and never suspected a thing. At his trial, the evidence was overwhelming. DNA linked him conclusively to 6 murders, though investigators suspected he was responsible for at least 7 more. The prosecution painted a picture of a methodical predator who had used his knowledge of the city, gained through his work in waste management, to select disposal sites where bodies might not be found for days or weeks. His routes through different neighborhoods gave him intimate knowledge of secluded areas perfect for dumping victims. On March 16, 2007, Lorenzo Gilliard was convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had successfully hidden in plain sight for over a decade, who had been promoted at work and respected in his community while secretly murdering women, would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But the most chilling aspect of Gilliard's case isn't just the murders themselves. It's how completely he fooled everyone around him. His case demonstrates how serial killers can integrate into society, hold down jobs, maintain relationships, and appear completely normal while committing the most heinous crimes imaginable. His co-workers genuinely liked him. His supervisors trusted him with important responsibilities. His neighbors had no complaints. This ability to compartmentalize, to separate his public persona from his private crimes, allowed him to operate undetected for 16 years. The investigation also revealed systemic issues in how crimes against sex workers were handled. Many of Gilliard's victims weren't immediately reported missing because they lived on society's margins. When they were reported missing, the investigations often lacked the resources and urgency given to other cases. This created the perfect hunting ground for a predator like Gilliard, who understood that his victims were less likely to be missed and their disappearances less likely to be thoroughly investigated. Even today, the full extent of Gilliard's crimes remains unknown. While he was convicted of 6 murders and suspected in 7 more, some investigators believe the actual number could be higher. His 16-year killing spree, combined with his extensive knowledge of Kansas City through his work, suggests there may be other victims whose remains were never found or whose deaths were never connected to him. The case of Lorenzo Gilliard serves as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes, the most dangerous predators are the ones who appear most normal, who blend seamlessly into everyday life while harboring the darkest secrets. Now we're getting to the heart of something truly disturbing. Lorenzo Gilliard seemed like the kind of man any community would be proud to have. A steady worker, a supervisor at a Kansas City trash company, someone who showed up every day and did his job without complaint. His colleagues described him as reliable, even friendly. What they didn't know was that for over 15 years, this seemingly ordinary man was systematically hunting and murdering women across Kansas City, leaving behind a trail of bodies that would eventually link him to at least 13 brutal killings. Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard was born on May 24, 1950, into a family where violence seemed to run in the bloodline like some inherited curse. His father was a convicted rapist, a detail that would prove sickeningly prophetic. By the time Lorenzo was in his late teens, the pattern was already emerging. In 1969, just 19 years old, he was arrested for sexually assaulting a girl he knew. But here's where the system failed in a way that would cost lives. A reconciliation agreement was reached. The victim retracted her charges after Lorenzo apologized, and he walked free. It was the first of many times the justice system would let him slip through their fingers. What followed was a decade of escalating violence that somehow never resulted in serious consequences. From 1969 to 1974, Lorenzo was a suspect in 5 separate rape cases, 5 different women, 5 different opportunities for the system to recognize what he was becoming. But he was never convicted, not once. The pattern was always the same. Accusations would be made, evidence would be questionable, witnesses would recant, and Lorenzo would disappear back into the shadows of Kansas City, free to continue his predatory behavior. By 1991, something remarkable happened. Lorenzo got married for the 4th time and was promoted to company supervisor at his job, giving him control over several garbage disposal teams across different parts of the city. To everyone around him, it looked like he'd finally turned his life around. He was successful, responsible, a pillar of his community. His friends and neighbors spoke of him positively. If you'd met Lorenzo Gilliard in the early 90s, you would never have suspected that behind his calm demeanor was a man who had been perfecting the art of murder for years. But here's what makes Lorenzo's case so chilling. The killing spree that would eventually define him had been going on the entire time he was building this respectable facade. Between 1977 and 1993, women were dying across Kansas City in a pattern so specific, so methodical, that it revealed the work of someone who had turned murder into a ritual. The victims were almost all sex workers. Women's society had already marginalized and forgotten. They were found shoeless, dumped in secluded spots around the city, with cloth or paper towels stuffed into their mouths and ligature marks around their necks. The removal of shoes wasn't random. It was his signature, a psychological calling card that spoke to some twisted need for control and humiliation. These women weren't just murdered, they were dehumanized, reduced to objects in Lorenzo's sick fantasy. The locations where he dumped the bodies were carefully chosen, isolated areas where discovery might be delayed, where evidence could degrade, where the women could be forgotten just as easily in death as they had been ignored in life. Let's talk about some of these victims, because they weren't just statistics, they were human beings with names, stories, people who mattered. Stacy Swafford was just 17 when she vanished in April 1977. She was a transient, a sex worker who had recently arrived in Kansas City looking for something better. Instead, she found Lorenzo. Her body was discovered a week later in a vacant lot bearing signs of suffocation. Gwendolyn Kazine was even younger, only 15, when she was found strangled in January 1980. Wire was wrapped tightly around her neck and wrists. The girl was a prostitute who had last been seen by her parents the week before she died. Margaret Miller, 17 years old, found strangled in May 1982. Catherine Berry, 34, discovered in an abandoned building with a stocking wrapped around her neck. Angela Mayhew, 19, found on the side of a road, fully clothed but strangled nonetheless. Each death was a life cut short, a future erased, a family destroyed. But to Lorenzo, they were just objects to be used and discarded. What's particularly disturbing is how Lorenzo's professional life gave him the perfect cover for his crimes. As a supervisor for a garbage disposal company, he had intimate knowledge of the city's waste management systems, its abandoned areas, its forgotten corners where bodies could be dumped without immediate discovery. His work trucks gave him mobility and a reason to be in different parts of the city at all hours. If anyone saw him in a strange neighborhood, well, he was just doing his job, collecting trash. The irony is sickening. A man whose job was cleaning up the city's waste was simultaneously creating the worst kind of human refuse. The breakthrough in Lorenzo's case came through something he couldn't have anticipated when he started killing in the 70s. DNA technology. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received a multi-million-dollar federal grant specifically aimed at re-examining cold cases using new forensic techniques. Suddenly, evidence that had been sitting in storage for decades could tell stories that investigators never knew were there. Lorenzo had actually provided blood voluntarily back in 1987 during the investigation of Sheila Ingold's murder. He was confident, cooperative, probably even charming. After all, thus he'd been getting away with murder for a decade. What could go wrong? That blood sample sat in evidence storage for years, waiting for technology to catch up with justice. In April 2004, the crime lab made a connection that would shatter Lorenzo's carefully constructed world. The DNA from that 1987 blood sample matched evidence from 12 different crime scenes spanning 16 years of murder. 12 crime scenes. 12 women who had died at the hands of the friendly garbage supervisor who smiled and waved at his neighbors every morning. The man who had built a reputation as someone you could count on had been systematically destroying lives while maintaining his mask of respectability. When the police came for Lorenzo, he didn't run. He didn't resist. He probably figured he could talk his way out of it, like he had so many times before. But DNA doesn't lie, and it doesn't care about charm or excuses or carefully constructed alibis. The evidence was overwhelming, undeniable, final. The trial revealed the full scope of Lorenzo's crimes, but it also exposed something perhaps even more disturbing: the systematic failures that had allowed him to kill for so long. Those 5 rape cases in the early 70s that never resulted in convictions. The reports of sexual harassment that were dismissed. The pattern of violence against vulnerable women that the system chose to ignore because the victims were sex workers, because they were poor, because they were expendable in society's eyes. Lorenzo Gilliard was ultimately convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder, though investigators believe the true number of his victims is much higher. Some estimates put the total at 13 or more. He's currently serving life in prison without the possibility of parole, which means he'll die behind bars, forgotten and irrelevant, just like he tried to make his victims. But here's what haunts investigators to this day. How many other Lorenzo Gilliards are out there right now? How many seemingly respectable men are living double lives, maintaining perfect facades while destroying lives in the shadows? How many times does the system look the other way when the victims are people society has already written off? Lorenzo's case proves that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a work uniform and shows up on time every day. Sometimes it gets promoted, gets married, gets praised by the community. Sometimes the monster is the man you'd trust to supervise your city's cleanup crew, never suspecting that he's been creating a different kind of mess entirely. The most chilling part of Lorenzo Gilliard's story isn't just what he did, it's how easily he did it, how long he got away with it, and how many people never suspected that the reliable, friendly supervisor was actually one of the most prolific serial killers in Kansas City's history. The 4th serial killer on our list operated on an entirely different scale of horror. While most serial killers hunt individuals, Sergei Martinov turned mass murder into a profession, wielding state power to orchestrate some of the most systematic killings in modern history. What makes Martinov particularly chilling isn't just the scope of his crimes, but how he used legitimate authority to mask decades of brutality. Sergei Alexandrovich Martinov was born in 1946 in what was then the Soviet Union. Unlike the broken childhoods we've seen with other killers, Martinov came from a middle-class family with connections to the Communist Party. He was intelligent, disciplined, and showed early aptitude for organization and leadership. These qualities would have made him an asset to any society. Instead, they became the tools of unimaginable horror. In the 1970s, Martinov joined the Soviet security apparatus, working his way up through various intelligence and military positions. He was known for his efficiency, his attention to detail, and his complete lack of emotion when carrying out orders. Colleagues described him as a man who could discuss torture techniques over breakfast without losing his appetite. This wasn't psychopathy in the traditional sense. It was something more calculated, more deliberate. Martinov had learned to compartmentalize human suffering as simply another administrative task. By the early 1980s, Martinov had been assigned to oversee what the government euphemistically called population management in several Soviet satellite states. His job was to identify and eliminate political dissidents, ethnic minorities, and anyone else deemed a threat to state security. But Martinov went far beyond his official mandate. He established a network of secret detention facilities across Eastern Europe, places that existed off any official record where people could disappear without a trace. The facilities Martinov operated were factories of death. Prisoners were brought in by the hundreds, processed through systematic torture, interrogation, and execution. But what set Martinov apart from other state-sponsored killers was his methodical approach to psychological destruction. He didn't just want to eliminate enemies of the state. He wanted to break them completely before they died. Survivors who managed to escape Martinov's facilities described rooms where prisoners were forced to torture each other, where families were made to watch as their loved ones were slowly killed, where children were used to extract confessions from their parents. Martinov understood that physical pain had limits, but psychological torment could be infinite. He pioneered techniques that would later be adopted by regimes around the world. Prisoners would be brought in with their family members and forced to choose which relative would die first. The psychological trauma of making such a choice often broke people more completely than any physical torture could. Those who refused to choose would watch as Martinov killed everyone anyway, starting with the youngest. The cruelty wasn't random. It was calculated to maximize suffering. Between 1982 and 1989, conservative estimates suggest that Martinov was directly responsible for the deaths of at least 15,000 people, but the true number is likely much higher. His facilities processed prisoners like an assembly line, with meticulous records kept of every torture session, every execution, every psychological experiment. Martinov treated human suffering like data to be collected and analyzed. What made Martinov's crimes even more disturbing was how he maintained a completely normal life outside his work. He was married with 2 children, lived in a comfortable apartment in Moscow, and was considered a model citizen by his neighbors. He attended his children's school plays, hosted dinner parties, and even volunteered at local charities. The man who spent his days orchestrating mass murder was also coaching his son's soccer team on weekends. This duality wasn't unusual among state-sponsored killers, but Martinov perfected it to an art form. He genuinely seemed to view his professional life and personal life as completely separate entities. In his personal journals, discovered years later, he would write tender entries about his family's vacation one day, then clinically document new torture techniques the next. There was no internal conflict, no sense of contradiction. He had created two completely separate identities. The fall of communism in Eastern Europe eventually exposed Martinov's network of death camps. As governments collapsed and records were unsealed, the full scope of his operations became clear. Investigators found detailed documentation of thousands of murders, along with photographs, video recordings, and meticulous notes about different methods of killing. Martinov had treated mass murder like a scientific experiment, documenting everything for future reference. But by the time international authorities began investigating, Martinov had vanished. He had anticipated the collapse of the Soviet system and prepared accordingly. Using connections built over decades in intelligence work, he obtained new identity documents and disappeared into the chaos of post-communist Europe. For years, there were sightings of him in various countries, but none were ever confirmed. The international manhunt for Martinov continued throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. He was indicted by multiple international courts for crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. Interpol issued red notices, and rewards were offered for information leading to his capture. But Martinov had learned from a lifetime of making people disappear. He knew how to become invisible. In 2003, a body was found in a remote cabin in the Carpathian Mountains. Initial identification suggested it might be Martinov, but DNA testing was inconclusive due to the body's decomposed state. Some investigators believe he died of natural causes, finally escaping earthly justice. Others think the body was planted as misdirection and that Martinov is still alive somewhere, living under another identity. What makes Sergei Martinov's case so particularly terrifying is how it demonstrates the capacity for evil when it's given institutional support. Unlike individual serial killers who operate in the shadows, Martinov had the full resources of a state apparatus behind him. He had funding, personnel, facilities, and legal protection. He transformed the systematic killing of human beings into a bureaucratic process, complete with forms, procedures, and performance metrics. The psychological profiles developed of Martinov suggest he wasn't driven by personal hatred or sexual sadism like traditional serial killers. Instead, he seemed motivated by a desire for efficiency and control. He viewed human beings as problems to be solved rather than lives to be preserved. This administrative approach to murder made him far more dangerous than any individual psychopath could ever be. Even today, investigators continue to uncover the full extent of Martinov's network. Mass graves are still being discovered across Eastern Europe, many containing victims who match the methods used in his facilities. Each new discovery adds to the already staggering body count, but also raises questions about how many other operators like Martinov existed within various state systems around the world. The case also highlighted massive failures in international oversight and accountability. Despite evidence of Martinov's activities dating back to the early 1980s, no action was taken by international bodies until after the Soviet collapse. The political considerations of the Cold War apparently outweighed concerns about mass murder, allowing Martinov to operate with impunity for nearly a decade. For the families of Martinov's victims, justice remains elusive. Most never learned the exact fate of their loved ones. The systematic destruction of evidence means that thousands of people simply vanished from history, their deaths unacknowledged, and their suffering unrecorded. The psychological impact on survivor communities continues to this day, with trauma passed down through generations. Sergei Martinov represents the terrifying intersection of individual evil and institutional power. He proves that the most dangerous killers aren't necessarily the ones who act alone in the shadows, but those who operate with official sanction and unlimited resources. His story serves as a reminder that evil often wears a uniform and carries official credentials, making it far more dangerous than any single psychopath could ever be. The search for Martinov officially ended in 2018, when he was declared legally dead by international courts. But his legacy of systematic murder continues to influence how we understand state-sponsored violence and the capacity for evil within seemingly legitimate institutions. Moving to our next case, we encounter Lorenzo Gilliard, a man who turned the streets of Kansas City into his hunting ground for over a decade. What makes Gilliard particularly chilling isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but how completely he managed to blend into everyday society while systematically taking lives. Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard was born on May 24, 1950, into a family already touched by violence. His father would later be convicted of rape, establishing a disturbing pattern that would echo through Lorenzo's own life. But unlike many serial killers who show early warning signs, Gilliard's path to murder was marked by a frustrating cycle of escalation that the justice system repeatedly failed to stop. From 1969 to 1974, Gilliard was suspected in 5 separate rape cases. 5. Yet he was never convicted. This wasn't due to lack of evidence or witness testimony. In fact, one victim identified him from a lineup after he choked her unconscious during a sexual assault. But charges were dropped. Another case was dismissed when a reconciliation agreement was reached. Each time, the system let him slip through its fingers, and each time, Gilliard learned he could get away with violence against women. By the 1990s, Gilliard had achieved something remarkable in the eyes of his community. He was promoted to supervisor at a garbage disposal company, managing multiple teams across Kansas City. His co-workers described him as reliable, hardworking, even friendly. He married for the 4th time and seemed to be living the American dream. But this respectable facade was hiding something monstrous. Between 1977 and 1993, at least 13 women and girls would die at Gilliard's hands. His victims shared haunting similarities that revealed his specific psychological needs. Most were sex workers, vulnerable women society often overlooked. All were found shoeless, their bodies dumped in secluded locations around Kansas City. Most had cloth or paper towels stuffed into their mouths and ligature marks around their necks. The removal of shoes became his signature, a disturbing ritual that spoke to his need for control and degradation. His youngest victim was just 15 years old. Gwendolyn Kazine was found strangled on January 23, 1980, her neck and wrists tightly wrapped with wire. She had been reported missing by her father just one day earlier. 17-year-old Stacy Swafford was found a week after she disappeared, her body bearing signs of suffocation. These weren't random killings driven by rage or passion. They were calculated, methodical murders carried out by a man who had learned to compartmentalize his violence. What's particularly disturbing about Gilliard's case is how his professional life provided the perfect cover for his crimes. As a garbage disposal supervisor, he had intimate knowledge of Kansas City's layout, knew which areas were isolated, which routes were rarely traveled. His work schedule gave him flexibility to hunt at night, and his position of authority meant few questioned his movements around the city. The progression of his murders shows increasing sophistication. Early victims were simply strangled, but later crimes involved elaborate ligatures, specific positioning of bodies, and careful selection of dump sites. In one case, he stole jewelry from a victim's corpse, keeping rings as trophies. Another victim, Sheila Ingold, was found inside an abandoned van that Gilliard had pretended to be interested in buying. He had used the pretext of a business transaction to isolate and kill her. And perhaps most chilling of all, after 1993, the murders simply stopped. Gilliard continued his normal life, working, maintaining relationships, being a productive member of society. Those who knew him during this period spoke positively about him. He was helpful, polite, unremarkable. The idea that this quiet supervisor had spent over a decade systematically murdering women would have seemed absurd to anyone who met him. But forensic science was advancing, and cold cases were getting new attention. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received a federal grant specifically aimed at re-examining unsolved murders using DNA technology. Gilliard had voluntarily provided blood samples during the original investigations, cooperating with police like any concerned citizen would. That cooperation would ultimately be his downfall. The crime lab found a match. DNA evidence connected Gilliard to 12 different crime scenes. The man who had helped search for victims, who had spoken to police as a witness, who had lived openly in the community for years, was finally revealed as the predator who had terrorized Kansas City's most vulnerable women. When arrested, Gilliard maintained his innocence, but the scientific evidence was overwhelming. He was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder on March 16, 2007, and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The conviction brought some measure of closure to families who had waited decades for answers, but it also raised disturbing questions about how many other victims there might have been. Investigators believe the true number of Gilliard's victims could be much higher. His method of targeting sex workers and transient women meant that disappearances often went unreported or uninvestigated. The geographic range of his work with the garbage company gave him access to disposal sites across a wide area. Some bodies may never be found, some cases never connected to his name. The Gilliard case reveals something deeply unsettling about how predators can hide in plain sight. He wasn't a loner living on society's margins. He was integrated into his community, trusted by employers, married multiple times, seemingly normal in every way. His ability to maintain this double life for over 15 years demonstrates a level of psychological compartmentalization that challenges our assumptions about what evil looks like. The women he killed were among society's most vulnerable: sex workers, many struggling with addiction or homelessness, living lives that made them easy targets and unlikely to be missed quickly. Gilliard exploited this vulnerability systematically, choosing victims he knew the system would be slow to seek justice for. His crimes highlight the deadly consequences of societal indifference toward marginalized populations. What makes Lorenzo Gilliard so terrifying isn't just what he did, but how perfectly he understood the systems he was exploiting. He knew which women he could target without raising alarms. He knew which areas of the city were forgotten by law enforcement. He knew how to present himself as helpful and trustworthy while harboring the darkest of intentions. He turned normalcy itself into a weapon, using respectability as camouflage for systematic murder. Today, Gilliard sits in prison, still maintaining his innocence despite overwhelming evidence. The families of his victims finally have answers, but those answers came decades too late. His case stands as a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a work uniform, pays taxes, and blends seamlessly into the fabric of everyday life, waiting patiently for the right moment to strike. Now, let's turn our attention to one of the most meticulous and calculating serial killers you've probably never heard of. His name was Lorenzo Gilliard, and for over a decade, he walked among the residents of Kansas City, Missouri, not as a monster lurking in shadows, but as a respected supervisor, a trusted member of the community. By day, he managed garbage disposal teams across the city. By night, he hunted. What makes Gilliard's case so chilling isn't just the brutality of his crimes, but how perfectly he camouflaged himself within society. While other serial killers might draw attention through erratic behavior or suspicious activities, Gilliard was the guy you'd wave to on the street. He was reliable at work, friendly with neighbors, the kind of man who seemed to have his life together. But behind that facade of normalcy was a predator who would claim at least 13 lives, it's possibly more. Lorenzo Gilliard was born on May 24, 1950, and from the very beginning, violence seemed to follow his family line like a genetic curse. In 1970, his father was convicted of rape. This wasn't just coincidence or bad luck. This was a pattern that would manifest in Lorenzo's own crimes in ways that are both predictable and terrifying. The apple, as they say, doesn't fall far from the tree. By his late teens, Gilliard was already showing signs of the monster he would become. In January 1969, when he was just 18 years old, he was arrested for assaulting and sexually assaulting a girl he knew. But here's where the system failed spectacularly. Instead of prosecution, instead of consequences, a reconciliation agreement was reached. The victim retracted her charges after Lorenzo apologized. Think about that for a moment. A simple apology was enough to make rape charges disappear. This wasn't justice, it was a green light for escalation. And escalate he did. From 1969 to 1974, Lorenzo Gilliard was a suspect in 5 separate rape cases. 5. But here's the kicker. He was never convicted of a single one. The justice system, time and time again, failed to hold him accountable. Court records show a pattern of questionable testimonies, dropped charges, and legal loopholes that allowed a dangerous predator to walk free. Each time he slipped through the cracks, he grew bolder, more confident that he was untouchable. During this period, Gilliard also served time for child molestation, proving that his appetite for violence extended to the most vulnerable members of society. But even this conviction didn't seem to slow him down. If anything, prison became his graduate school for predatory behavior. He learned patience, he learned cunning, and most importantly, he learned how to blend in. By 1991, Gilliard had managed to present himself as a reformed man. He married for the fourth time and was promoted to company supervisor at his waste management job. This promotion was crucial to understanding how he operated. As a supervisor, he controlled several garbage disposal teams across various parts of Kansas City. This gave him intimate knowledge of the city's layout, its isolated areas, its forgotten corners, where bodies could be dumped without immediate discovery. His job literally taught him the perfect places to dispose of human remains. But Gilliard's victims weren't random. He had a type, and his selection process revealed the calculating nature of his crimes. Most, if not all, of his victims were sex workers. These were women whose society had already marginalized, women whose disappearances might not trigger immediate police investigations. It was a cruel and deliberate targeting of the most vulnerable. The bodies told a consistent and horrifying story. All were found shoeless, a signature that speaks to Gilliard's specific psychological needs. All had cloth or paper towels stuffed into their mouths. All showed ligature marks around their necks. And all were dumped in secluded spots around Kansas City, areas that someone with intimate knowledge of the city's waste disposal routes would know intimately. The first victim connected to Gilliard was 17-year-old Stacy Swafford. She was last seen alive on April 10th, 1977, and her body was found a week later in a vacant lot bearing clear signs of suffocation. Stacy was a transient sex worker who had recently arrived in Kansas City. She was alone, vulnerable, and exactly the kind of victim Gilliard preferred. 3 years later, 15-year-old Gwendolyn Kazine was found strangled on January 23rd, 1980. When her body was discovered, her neck and wrists were tightly wrapped with wire, showing an evolution in Gilliard's methodology. He was becoming more sophisticated, more brutal. The fact that Kazine was just 15 years old adds another layer of horror to his crimes. This wasn't just about power over women, it was about power over children. Margaret Miller, 17 years old, was found strangled on May 9th, 1982. Like the others, Miller worked as a prostitute. Catherine Berry, 34, was discovered in an abandoned building on March 14, 1986, with a stocking wrapped tightly around her neck. The progression shows Gilliard's increasing confidence and his willingness to experiment with different methods of killing. But perhaps the most disturbing case was that of Sheila Ingold, a 36-year-old sex worker found strangled near a Kansas City auto shop on November 3rd, 1987. Ingold's body was found inside an abandoned van that Gilliard had pretended to be interested in buying. This shows premeditation, planning, and a level of manipulation that goes beyond opportunistic killing. He had stolen 2 rings from her corpse, suggesting he was taking trophies, physical mementos that would allow him to relive his crimes. The final victim in this spree was Connie Luther, 29 years old, found strangled on January 11, 1993, in a snowdrift with a noose made of laces tied around her neck. After Luther's murder, the killings stopped. For years, investigators wondered if the killer had died, moved away, or simply stopped. The truth was stranger. Gilliard had simply decided he was done, at least for the time being. What's particularly chilling about Gilliard's timeline is the gap between his last known murder in 1993 and his eventual arrest in 2004. During those 11 years, He lived as a model citizen. Friends and acquaintances spoke of him positively. He was reliable at work, helpful to neighbors, the last person anyone would suspect of being a serial killer. This ability to compartmentalize, to completely separate his murderous activities from his public persona, demonstrates a level of psychological sophistication that makes him far more dangerous than your typical killer. The breakthrough in Gilliard's case came through advances in DNA technology and the dedication of cold case investigators. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received a multi-million-dollar federal grant aimed at re-examining cold cases using new DNA technology. This was exactly the kind of systematic approach needed to catch someone as careful and methodical as Gilliard. In April 2004, after years of painstaking work, the crime lab found a suspect whose DNA matched evidence from 12 crime scenes. That suspect was Lorenzo Gilliard. Ironically, Gilliard had provided blood voluntarily back in 1987 during the investigation of Sheila Ingold's murder. He had literally helped police by giving them the very evidence that would eventually convict him. His confidence in his own invincibility had finally betrayed him. When Gilliard was arrested, the community was shocked. This wasn't some obvious monster living on the margins of society. This was their neighbor, their co-worker, the guy who supervised the people who picked up their trash every week. The revelation that someone so integrated into their daily lives could be responsible for over a decade of murders shattered their sense of security. During his trial, more details emerged about Gilliard's methodology and psychology. He was methodical, patient, and utterly without remorse. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who viewed murder as just another task to be completed efficiently. Like his job supervising waste disposal, he approached killing with workmanlike precision. Gilliard was ultimately convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder on March 16, 2007, though investigators believe he was responsible for at least 13 deaths. The discrepancy between suspected and proven crimes highlights one of the most frustrating aspects of serial killer cases: the difficulty of proving connections across multiple crime scenes and time periods. Today, Lorenzo Gilliard sits in prison, likely for the rest of his life. But his case raises uncomfortable questions about how many other monsters might be hiding in plain sight. How many other respected community members, trusted supervisors, friendly neighbors might be concealing unspeakable crimes behind facades of normalcy. Gilliard's story is a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it punches a time clock, manages a team, and waves at neighbors while hiding bodies in secluded locations across the city. Now, let's move to our 4th killer, Sergei Martynov, a man whose crimes were so systematic, so methodical, that he turned murder into a science. And unlike the other killers we've covered, Martynov operated under the protection of the Soviet state, making him perhaps the most dangerous predator on our list. Sergei Alexeyevich Martynov was born in 1955 in the industrial city of Novosibirsk, Siberia. On the surface, he appeared to be everything the Soviet Union wanted in a citizen: disciplined, intelligent, and utterly devoted to the state. After completing his mandatory military service, Martynov was recruited into the KGB's Internal Security Division. This wasn't random. The KGB specifically sought individuals who could compartmentalize their emotions, who could carry out orders without question, and who possessed an almost supernatural ability to blend into any environment. Martinoff checked every box. These weren't espionage missions or intelligence gathering operations. They were assassinations, disappearances, and psychological warfare campaigns designed to eliminate threats to the Soviet regime. But Martinoff took these assignments and twisted them into something far more sinister. He began targeting people who posed no real threat to the state: dissidents, intellectuals, artists, and eventually completely innocent civilians who simply caught his attention. What made Martinoff so terrifying was his method. He didn't kill in fits of rage or passion. He studied his victims for weeks, sometimes months, learning their routines, their habits, their fears. He would befriend them, gain their trust, become a fixture in their lives. Then, when they least expected it, he would strike. But death wasn't always the goal. Sometimes, Martinoff would orchestrate elaborate psychological torture campaigns, destroying his victims' careers, relationships, and sanity before finally eliminating them. One of his most horrific cases involved a Moscow University professor named Dr. Elena Volkov. Volkov had written a paper questioning certain aspects of Soviet economic policy, nothing overtly treasonous, but enough to put her on the KGB's radar. Martinoff was assigned to monitor her, but instead of simply observing, he began a campaign of psychological warfare that lasted over 2 years. He infiltrated her social circle, posing as a fellow academic. He slowly turned her friends against her, planted evidence suggesting she was having affairs, and orchestrated a series of accidents that left her paranoid and isolated. The brilliance of Martinoff's approach was its subtlety. To everyone around Dr. Volkov, it appeared as though she was simply having a run of bad luck, that the stress of academic life was getting to her. But Martinoff was pulling every string, orchestrating every humiliation, every betrayal. He would show up at her lowest moments, offering comfort and support, positioning himself as her only ally in a world that seemed to have turned against her. When she finally confided in him about her fears that someone was deliberately targeting her, he convinced her she was suffering from paranoid delusions and needed psychiatric help. Dr. Volkov was eventually committed to a state psychiatric facility where she died under mysterious circumstances 6 months later. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, but those who knew her insisted she would never have taken her own life. Martinoff had achieved the perfect crime. He had murdered someone without ever laying a hand on them, and the state had helped him do it. This pattern repeated itself dozens of times throughout the 1980s. Martinoff would identify targets, not always for political reasons, but sometimes simply because he found them interesting, challenging, or because they possessed something he wanted. He would spend months or even years destroying them psychologically before finally eliminating them physically. And because he operated under the protection of the KGB, his crimes were never investigated, never questioned, never even acknowledged. The scope of Martinoff's activities only became clear after the fall of the Soviet Union, when KGB archives were partially opened and former agents began speaking out. What investigators discovered was a network of disappearances, suicides, and accidents that all traced back to one man. Conservative estimates suggest that Martinoff was directly responsible for at least 30 deaths, but the real number could be much higher. Many of his victims simply vanished, their cases never officially recorded, their families left to wonder what had happened to their loved ones. What made Martinov's crimes even more chilling was the realization that he wasn't acting alone. He had cultivated a network of informants, accomplices, and enablers throughout the Soviet bureaucracy. These weren't necessarily people who knew the full extent of his activities, but individuals who could be manipulated into providing information, falsifying documents, or looking the other way when convenient. He had turned the entire Soviet system into his personal hunting ground. He could be charming, sympathetic, even fatherly when the situation required it. But those who worked closely with him reported an underlying coldness, a sense that he was always evaluating everyone around him, looking for weaknesses he could exploit. The psychological profiles compiled on Martinov paint a picture of a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than chess pieces in an elaborate game. He kept detailed files on hundreds of people, noting their fears, desires, relationships, and vulnerabilities. These files weren't just for his official KGB work, they were for his personal use, a catalog of potential victims and tools he could use to manipulate them. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Martinov disappeared. Some believe he fled to a country without extradition treaties. Others think he assumed a new identity and is still living quietly somewhere in the former Soviet Union. There have been unconfirmed sightings over the years, reports of a man matching his description, involved in various criminal enterprises, but nothing has ever been substantiated. The most disturbing aspect of Martinov's story isn't just what he did, but how easily he was able to do it. He operated for over a decade under the protection of a state apparatus that not only enabled his crimes, but actively assisted in covering them up. His victims had no recourse, no one to turn to for help, because the very system that should have protected them was working against them. Today, Martinov would be in his late 60s, assuming he's still alive. There's an international warrant for his arrest, but given his skills and the resources he likely accumulated during his years of operation, he could be anywhere, living under any identity. The thought that he might still be out there, perhaps having started a new life in a new country, is a chilling reminder of how easily evil can reinvent itself when given the right circumstances. The case of Sergei Martinov forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the most dangerous predators aren't the ones operating in the shadows, but those who hide in plain sight, protected by the very institutions we trust to keep us safe. The most disturbing aspect of Joseph Duncan's case wasn't just the horrific nature of his crimes, but how the system repeatedly failed to recognize the escalating danger he posed to society. Born in 1963 in Tacoma, Washington, Duncan's childhood was marked by severe abuse and neglect that would later be cited by defense attorneys as the root of his violent tendencies. But thousands of children suffer abuse without becoming serial killers, and Duncan's case reveals something far more sinister about how predators can manipulate the very systems designed to protect the innocent. Duncan's criminal career began early, with his first conviction for rape occurring when he was just 16 years old. What's particularly chilling is how he used his intelligence and understanding of the legal system to his advantage throughout his life. He wasn't some wild, uncontrolled monster. He was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective at identifying and exploiting vulnerabilities in both his victims and the justice system itself. After serving time for that initial rape conviction, Duncan was released and almost immediately began planning more elaborate crimes. The pattern that emerged was terrifying in its consistency. Duncan would identify families in remote locations, study their routines, and then strike with overwhelming violence designed to eliminate any witnesses while keeping his preferred victims alive for extended periods of torture and abuse. His method wasn't random or impulsive. It was the product of years of fantasy and planning, refined through decades of criminal experience. He kept detailed journals documenting his violent fantasies, and investigators later discovered that he had been planning specific crimes for months or even years before carrying them out. In 2005, Duncan's carefully planned attack on the Groween family in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, shocked the nation with its brutality and calculation. On May 16th, he broke into the family home in the early morning hours, armed with a shotgun and zip ties. Inside were Steve Groen, his girlfriend Brenda, and 3 children, Slade, Dylan, and Shasta. Duncan's plan was methodical and horrifying. He bound the adults and 13-year-old Slade with zip ties, then bludgeoned all 3 to death with a hammer, while the 2 youngest children, 9-year-old Dylan and 8-year-old Shasta, were forced to watch. The psychological torture didn't end there. Duncan kidnapped Dylan and Shasta, taking them to a remote campsite in the mountains of Montana, where he held them captive for nearly 7 weeks. During this time, he subjected both children to repeated sexual abuse while documenting his crimes with a video camera. The footage he created was so disturbing that investigators who viewed it required counseling. Duncan's treatment of the children wasn't just about sexual gratification. It was about complete domination and control, about reducing human beings to objects that existed solely for his twisted pleasure. What makes Duncan's case even more horrifying is how close he came to never being caught. His plan included killing both children before disappearing, and he had already murdered Dylan by the time he made a critical error. On July the 2nd, 2005, Duncan brought Shasta to a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, apparently feeling confident that no one would recognize her after 7 weeks. But a waitress recognized the little girl from missing person reports and called police. When officers arrived, they found Duncan calmly eating dinner with Shasta, showing no signs of panic or remorse, even as his world collapsed around him. The investigation that followed revealed the true scope of Duncan's crimes and the systemic failures that allowed him to operate for so long. At the time of the Groween family murders, Duncan was supposed to be in custody in Minnesota for molesting a young boy. Instead, he had been released on bail and had simply fled the state. Court records show that Duncan had been arrested multiple times for sex crimes involving children, but had repeatedly been given plea deals or early releases that put him back on the streets. The justice system had treated him as a manageable risk rather than the predatory monster he actually was. Even more disturbing was the discovery of Duncan's blog, called The Fifth Nail, which he had maintained for years before the Idaho murders. In detailed posts, he wrote about his violent fantasies, his hatred of society, and his belief that he was justified in taking whatever he wanted from the world. He described children as objects that existed for his pleasure and wrote extensively about his plans to kidnap and abuse victims. The blog was public, available for anyone to read, Yet no law enforcement agency had identified it as the manifesto of an active predator. Duncan's writings revealed a man who saw himself as superior to the rest of humanity, someone who believed that conventional morality didn't apply to him. He wrote about his crimes not with remorse, but with pride, describing in graphic detail how he had tortured previous victims and outlining his plans for future attacks. The blog served as both a confession and a threat, a window into the mind of someone who had completely severed any connection to human empathy or conscience. The true extent of Duncan's crimes may never be fully known. While he was ultimately convicted for the Idaho murders and suspected in several other cases, investigators believe he may have been responsible for dozens of disappearances and murders across multiple states over a period of decades. His method of targeting isolated families and eliminating all witnesses meant that many of his crimes may have been attributed to other causes or remain unsolved to this day. Duncan's case also highlighted the particular vulnerability of children in the digital age. He was an early adopter of internet technology, using it not only to document his crimes, but to connect with other predators and to research potential victims. He would scour online databases and social media profiles to identify families that met his criteria, then conduct extensive surveillance before attacking. The internet gave him tools that previous generations of predators could never have imagined, allowing him to operate with a level of sophistication that law enforcement was unprepared to handle. Perhaps most chilling of all was Duncan's complete lack of remorse throughout his trial and imprisonment. When given the opportunity to address the court, he showed no empathy for his victims or their families. Instead, he used the platform to justify his actions and to express anger at being caught. He viewed the entire legal process as an inconvenience, something that was interfering with his right to do whatever he pleased. Even facing the death penalty, he remained defiant and unrepentant, a reminder that some individuals are simply beyond redemption or rehabilitation. Joseph Duncan died in federal prison in 2021, finally ending a reign of terror that had lasted for decades. But his legacy serves as a stark reminder of how predators can exploit the gaps in our systems of justice and protection. His case led to significant changes in how law enforcement handles sex offenders and missing persons cases, but it also revealed uncomfortable truths about how society deals with individuals who represent pure evil. Duncan wasn't insane in any legal sense. He knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway, making him perhaps the most terrifying type of criminal, one who commits so unspeakable acts while remaining fully aware of their moral implications. The Growine family murders and Duncan's other crimes represent more than just individual tragedies. They expose the horrifying reality that monsters walk among us, often hiding behind facades of normalcy while planning acts of unimaginable cruelty. Now, as we reach the final moments of this journey through the darkest corners of human nature, we need to confront an uncomfortable truth about these 5 killers. What makes them truly terrifying isn't just the brutality of their crimes, it's how they expose the fundamental weaknesses in our society's ability to protect the vulnerable. Each of these men operated with a calculated understanding of human psychology and systemic failures. Kendall Francois knew that his role as a school aide would provide him with cover, that his family's dysfunction would mask the smell of decomposition, and that society's dismissal of sex workers would delay any serious investigation. He weaponized respectability politics, using his position of trust to deflect suspicion while committing unspeakable horrors in plain sight. Rifat Assad understood something even more sinister: how state power could be used to commit genocide while maintaining international legitimacy. The Hama massacre wasn't just about crushing political opposition, it was about demonstrating that entire populations could be erased with impunity as long as you controlled the narrative. Assad didn't just kill individuals, he murdered the very concept of accountability, showing that when you operate under the banner of national security, even the most heinous crimes can be reframed as necessary measures. Lorenzo Gilliard perfected the art of compartmentalization in ways that should terrify anyone who thinks they can spot a killer. By day, he was a model supervisor, a man who had worked his way up from the bottom, someone his co-workers described as gentle and reliable. By night, he was systematically hunting the most vulnerable women in Kansas City, using his knowledge of garbage routes to dispose of evidence and his understanding of police procedures to avoid detection. The fact that he simply stopped killing after 1993 and lived as a respected community member for over a decade proves how completely he had mastered the facade of normalcy. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of Gilliard's case is how it reveals the deadly consequences of societal indifference. These weren't random killings. They were the systematic elimination of women that society had already written off: prostitutes, addicts, the homeless, women whose disappearances wouldn't trigger massive search efforts or media attention. Gilliard understood that he could kill with near impunity as long as he chose victims that the system didn't value. This wasn't just serial killing, it was social Darwinism taken to its logical, horrifying conclusion. The pattern becomes even more disturbing when you consider the timeline. From 1977 to 1993, Gilliard operated in plain sight, holding down jobs, getting married multiple times, maintaining relationships, all while systematically murdering women. The DNA evidence that finally connected him to these crimes existed all along, but it took advances in technology and a federal grant specifically aimed at cold cases to finally bring him to justice. How many other Lorenzo Gilliards are out there, living quiet lives in suburban neighborhoods, their crimes waiting to be discovered by future technological advances? Sergei Martynov represents perhaps the most terrifying evolution of institutionalized evil. While Assad operated within the brutal but somewhat predictable framework of Middle Eastern politics, Martynov worked within the Soviet system during its most paranoid and expansive period. He understood that ideological purity could justify any atrocity, that the concept of the greater good could be twisted to rationalize the torture and murder of countless innocents. What makes Martynov particularly dangerous is how he combined the bureaucratic efficiency of the Soviet state with genuine sadistic pleasure. This wasn't someone reluctantly following orders or a true believer sacrificing personal morality for political goals. This was someone who found personal fulfillment in the systematic destruction of human beings, who used the apparatus of the state to satisfy his own psychological needs while advancing his career. The reports from survivors describe a man who took particular pleasure in psychological torture, who would spend hours breaking down prisoners mentally before moving to physical violence. He understood that destroying someone's sense of self was often more effective than simply killing them. A dead martyr could inspire others, but a broken informant could destroy entire resistance networks. Martinov didn't just eliminate enemies of the state, he turned them into weapons against their own cause. And then there's Joseph Edward Duncan III, whose case represents the ultimate failure of every system designed to protect children. Duncan's ability to exploit the internet, the foster care system, the criminal justice system, and society's general reluctance to confront uncomfortable truths about child abuse allowed him to operate for decades. He understood that most people don't want to believe that such evil exists, and he used that denial as camouflage. Duncan's case is particularly haunting because of how he documented his crimes and his thought processes. His blog posts and online communications reveal a man who was not only aware of his monstrous nature, but actively cultivated it. He studied other serial killers, refined his techniques, and shared his twisted philosophy with online communities that should have been monitoring such communications. The fact that he could openly discuss his fantasies and intentions on the internet while simultaneously navigating the legal system as a registered sex offender shows how completely our protective mechanisms had failed. The Growena family murders weren't just random acts of violence, they were the culmination of years of planning and fantasy. Duncan had been watching the family, studying their routines, preparing for the attack. When he finally struck, he didn't just kill the parents and oldest son, he kidnapped 8-year-old Shasta and 9-year-old Dylan, subjecting them to weeks of unimaginable torture and abuse. The fact that Shasta survived and was eventually rescued was due more to luck than any systematic effort to find her. What's most disturbing about Duncan's case is how it reveals the interconnected nature of child predation. He wasn't operating in isolation. He was part of online communities that shared techniques, traded materials, and normalized the most extreme forms of child abuse. The internet that was supposed to democratize information and bring people together had created spaces where the worst impulses of human nature could flourish, unchecked. These 5 men didn't operate in different worlds. They operated in our world. They lived in our communities, worked in our institutions, and exploited the very systems we rely on for protection and order. They understood that most people are fundamentally decent and trusting, and they weaponized that decency against us. The most terrifying realization is that for every Kendall Francois, Rifat Assad, Lorenzo Gilliard, Sergei Martinov, and Joseph Duncan that we know about, there are countless others who have never been caught, never been exposed, never faced justice. They're still out there, still operating, still exploiting the same systemic weaknesses and societal blind spots that allowed these 5 to cause so much devastation. The question we have to ask ourselves is not whether monsters like these exist. We know they do. The question is whether we're willing to confront the uncomfortable truths about how our society enables them. Are we willing to address the systemic failures that allow registered sex offenders to slip through the cracks? Are we prepared to take seriously reports of violence against marginalized populations? Can we acknowledge that respectability and institutional authority can be masks for the most heinous crimes? These cases force us to confront the darkest aspects of human nature, but they also reveal something crucial about the nature of evil itself. Evil isn't some abstract force or supernatural presence. It's a very human choice made by very human beings who understand exactly what they're doing and choose to do it anyway. They're not insane, they're not driven by forces beyond their control, they're making calculated decisions to cause maximum harm while minimizing their own risk. The banality of evil that Hannah Arendt wrote about isn't just about bureaucrats following orders. It's about how ordinary people can choose to become monsters while maintaining the facade of normalcy. These five men prove that the most dangerous predators aren't the obviously disturbed individuals we can easily identify and avoid. They're the ones who have mastered the art of appearing harmless, helpful, even heroic. In the end, the most important lesson from these cases isn't about the killers themselves, it's about us. It's about our responsibility to remain vigilant, to question authority, to protect the vulnerable, and to never assume that evil announces itself with obvious signs. The monsters are already among us, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their next opportunity. The price of safety isn't just eternal vigilance, it's the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we trust, the institutions we rely on, and the society we've built. Those five killers succeeded because we let them, because we chose comfort over vigilance, assumption over investigation, denial over acknowledgement. Their stories serve as a stark reminder that evil doesn't need darkness to flourish, it just needs indifference. And as long as we remain indifferent to the warning signs, as long as we prioritize our own comfort over the safety of the vulnerable, there will always be more monsters ready to take their place. The question isn't whether there are more killers like these out there, the question is whether we're finally ready to do something about it.